tell myself I'm only checking for water damage below the stacks, just following a thin ribbon of cold slipping through a seal that should be unbroken. And the lie almost works because it sounds like procedure. We recite procedures like psalms upstairs: parchment humidity, vellum shrinkage, foxing on margins, until repetition feels like absolution. But none of that explains why my fingers are already on the cracked wax when I see the Vatican crest fissured like an old scab. I should have stopped when the crest gave under my thumb like a healed wound breaking. I should have fetched a supervisor, filled out a form, let the day seal itself back over. Instead, I breathe into the gap, and the gap breathes back, colder and curiosity. My oldest sin decides for me. The door yields on a hinge that tries and fails to be silent, making a sound softer than expected, like a page turned by someone I cannot see. The stairwell is narrower than it should be, engineered to make a body confess by breath alone, and I count the steps because counting feels like penance. Frescoes flake along the descent, saints shedding paint like old skin. The faces that remain look past me toward some tribunal that lives just behind my shoulder. My torch beam stays low, because light makes everything more alive in these corridors, and I don't want the painted eyes to wake. The whisper I overheard in the reading room, two guards murmuring about a counter no one is supposed to mention, returns as a rhythm I can't pin to my pulse. I try to match it and fail. It is not my heartbeat. It is a second sound waiting for me to arrive. Drag marks score the lowest threshold, twin grooves that try not to exist and fail, proof that secrecy leaves clumsy fingerprints. Even the church cannot move a miracle without scuffing stone. Non in tempore, I whisper, not in time. Because a deacon once said it when the elevator stalled, and it felt like protection, though I know it is only habit dressed as prayer. The chamber resolves as my eyes adjust. Marble and brass, the air the color of old coins. Workbenches line the walls like pews repurposed for another liturgy. Dominating the center is a console of dials arranged in ranks, each face engraved with numerals that are almost, but not exactly, the numbers I know. The needles tick without touch. The sound is not a clock. It is wet at the edges, like a tongue tasting a rosary bead before letting it slide. I am not a mystic, I tell the room, as if the room requires credentials. I catalogue bindings, proof incipits, complain about catalogues that treat the 13th century as rumor. I say mechanism, the safe word for archivists who fear wonder, and trace copper conduits, braided wires, discreet vents that could hide fans and impersonate breath. There should be a mains switch, a breaker, a maintenance log to make the uncanny behave and sit where it is told. There is none. At the far left, an orphan dial with its nameplate removed, a faint shadow where a label once was. As I draw closer, the needle trembles with an eagerness that feels like a tension, stuttering and correcting in time with the expensive fear climbing my ribs. It wants me to be closer. I feel certain of that, and that certainty disgusts me. This is the moment where training should save me. Step back, record, report, wrap myself in bureaucracy until the story cools. Instead, I lean in until my breath clouds the face, and hairline etchings rise around the dial. No numerals, not letters either, more like the concept of counting etched in a dead alphabet. Feeling foolish, I fetch a polished plate from a workbench, the kind used to inspect gilding and hold the mirror to the dial. In reflection, the needle doesn't tremble. It jerks, decisive, as if something has caught scent. A hiss slips through the vents like a knife leaving a sheath, and beneath the hiss I hear a word in my father's voice, though he has been dead 10 years. One more. I don't say my name. I say the version my mother used when I disobeyed, the one that promised consequence. The needle rises like a dog lifting its head to a footstep. I should put down the mirror. I should leave. Instead, my hand finds a folder tucked beneath the console, sheets crisp as new snow, smelling faintly of myrrh and graphite. The handwriting is elegant and unhurried, a diplomatic hand I've met in papal correspondence, and the header is not a header but a sentence. Indices peccatorum, non-numerant est nominant. Indexes of sins. They do not count, they name. Procedures pretend to be instructions and read like confessions. When an index claims a subject, no sacrament may interfere. When the subject is named, avoid mirrors and water. If the dial begins to mirror respiration, suspend prayer and await direction. A red pencil chews the margins where someone has tried and failed to subtract meaning with notes. The edits only deepen the hole. It feels like looking down a well until the well looks back. Beneath the papers lies a book dressed in plain calf, humility that makes danger polite. It warms beneath my hands like it remembers other hands. The first leaf pretends to be blank until light finds the ink and rules emerge like breath on glass. Do not approach alone. Do not pronounce the fourth name. Do not allow the dial to mirror your face. Pray Psalm 51, but omit the line about creation lest it answer. Sign where indicated. The signature line is smudged with something more human than ink. I recognize the haloed brown of dried blood with the same certainty I recognize my own handwriting after a night without sleep. I should have stopped when I read the prohibition that included my face. But I keep reading because knowledge has always dressed itself in the clothes of mercy when it wants to be obeyed. Miserere me Deus, I think, but I do not say it aloud. Footsteps begin on the stair, measured, unembarrassed, and I return the book to its cradle, replace the folder, and draw the cloth over the console the way one tucks a child who has been awake too long. A figure fills the doorway, red-robed, but not in the polite crimson of audiences. This red remembers iron on the tongue and the deep echo of closed crypts. He does not look at me. He listens to the wall like a physician listening through marble. When his head turns, his face is beautiful in the way statues are beautiful, more than human, because it lacks the small wrongness that makes humanity credible. I will forget, I say, because I must say something, and I mean it as promise, threat, and spell. His mouth moves as if rearranging a prayer into a warning, and when he speaks his voice is small and cutting, like a paper slice. It will not forget you. Two fingers lift in a gesture that could be benediction or tally. Every dial advances by one. The sound is not loud, but it is unanimous, and unanimity is a theology. I flinch as though struck, and the memory of the mirror I was told to avoid arrives like a hand on my shoulder. I do not look. I cannot look. The room seems to hold its breath and then release it, the fan resuming with a papery sigh. I smooth the cloth again, the way you soothe a child who has seen too much. I tell myself I have not broken any vow that matters, that Curiositas can still be forgiven if it closes the door behind itself and keeps a secret. But the word secret feels strange in my mouth, heavy, metallic, as if the air has been mined out of it and replaced with weight. I climb the stairs, counting like a penitent, press the softened wax back into a shape that could deceive a tired eye, and try to believe in the ordinary. The problem is the counter believes in me. I should have stopped at the broken seal, but I kept reading, and now the counter knows exactly how I breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that single dial as it shook with each of my breaths. At first I thought it was coincidence, metal shifting in the cold, brass quivering the way old pipes sometimes thrum when air rushes through them, but the rhythm betrayed me. It wasn't random. It wasn't mechanical. Every inhale tugged the needle upward, every exhale let it fall back into place. It was breathing with me, like the chamber itself had become a lung, and I was no longer certain which of us was doing the breathing. The walls pressed in with every tick. The silence between each click was heavier than the sound itself, like a pause waiting for confession. Then I leaned closer, drawn by a kind of repulsion that behaves exactly like curiosity. And there, etched so faintly I thought it was shadow at first, I saw letters forming in the brass, not carved by hand, but appearing the way frost writes its shapes across glass. My name. Not the Latinized version on official rosters, not the clipped one my colleagues use in shorthand, but the intimate form only my mother used when she was angry. I mouthed it without sound, my lips trembling, and the dial seemed to shiver in agreement. A rush of cold crawled from the floor to my chest. I told myself I was overtired, that archivists are prone to seeing their names where none exist, as if the mind claws for attention in monotony. But that excuse dissolved when I realized I wasn't alone. In the far corner of the chamber, half subsumed by shadow where my torch had not wandered, stood a figure. Robes, red, not the scarlet of the cardinals I sometimes glimpsed above ground, but a darker shade, wine soaked into stone. His face, if it was a face, refused to resolve no matter how long I stared, like the outline of a statue deliberately blurred. He didn't move. He didn't breathe, at least not visibly. He only watched. The weight of that gaze forced a memory I did not want. The last time I stood at my father's bedside, when his eyes no longer belonged to him, but to something vast and waiting behind him. I whispered, "Who are you?" though I regretted it the instant it left my lips. The air caught the question and dropped it flat against the marble. No echo, as if the chamber refused to repeat what I had asked. The dial clicked once more, and this time the sound was accompanied by something wet, almost like the suction of lips parting after a prayer murmured too close to skin. I staggered backward, nearly toppling over one of the benches, and the figure tilted its head in a gesture I recognized too well. Recognition. It knew me. The letters on the dial burned clearer now, etched as though by invisible acid, each stroke tightening into permanence. I tried to look away, to fix my attention on anything else, the frescoes peeling above, the dust eddies by my shoes. But my name pulled me back like gravity. I had been catalogued. No prayer, no rationalization could undo it. I told myself to leave. I even took 2 steps toward the stair. But when I turned, the figure had shifted, impossibly fast, though it had not moved in the way bodies move. It was simply closer now, as though the distance had collapsed. My throat clenched. The chamber's air smelled suddenly of extinguished candles, that sour mix of wax and smoke, and beneath it something metallic, like fresh blood against iron keys. I thought of the phrase in the folder I had glimpsed earlier, "They do not count. They name," and the pieces began to arrange themselves into a truth I didn't want. This counter wasn't tallying my sins. It was claiming me. I remember pressing my palm against the brass, hoping physical touch would dispel hallucination. Instead, the metal was warm, warmer than skin should be, pulsing faintly as though a heartbeat throbbed beneath it. My own pulse staggered to keep up, and then faltered. For a terrifying moment, I couldn't tell if my body was borrowing rhythm from the dial, or if the dial was learning rhythm from me. I yanked my hand back, but the warmth lingered in my skin like an infection spreading outward. The figure finally moved, though the word moved fails it. It didn't walk. It folded distance in a way my mind resisted, now standing at the edge of the workbench where the torchlight could finally touch its garment. Not cloth, not really. It shimmered like woven ash, patterns that rearranged themselves when I blinked. And the hooded shadow beneath, though faceless, opened slightly, just enough for a whisper to bleed out. It wasn't in Latin. It wasn't even language. It was the sound of pages being torn slowly in half, stretched into syllables. Yet I understood it. It knows you. My knees weakened. I stumbled back, clutching at the edge of a shelf, scattering brittle manuscripts to the ground. The sound of parchment slapping stone seemed sacrilegious, but no guard appeared, no reprimand came. Only the counter clicked in steady rhythm with my rising panic. The figure did not bend to pick up the fallen pages, did not react at all. It merely turned its head slightly, the way a confessor turns when he already knows the sin before it's spoken. I thought of every lecture I had ever endured about temptation, about curiosity as original fault. Eve and the serpent, Origen dissecting scripture, Augustine confessing lusts into Latin permanence. I had always believed those warnings abstract. Now they crystallized. Curiosity is only a name for hunger, and hunger makes you visible to things that should never notice you. I wanted to scream, but my throat had become a sealed reliquary, holding words hostage. The counter clicked once more. My name shone brighter, each letter now luminous as if carved with fire. And then, God help me, the letters began rearranging. Not just my name. Other names bleeding into mine, surnames I didn't recognize but which felt ancestral, as though the brass was sewing me into a lineage of souls already claimed. I could see them flicker. Men and women erased from parish records, sinners consigned to silence, names forbidden to be spoken aloud. They were joining me. Or I was joining them. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed. At some point the figure faded, not in retreat, but as if acknowledging that the work was done, that the counter would finish what it had started without witness. I was left alone in the chamber, though the word alone has never felt less true. Every breath, every shudder, every unwilling thought drew another faint click from the dial, and each one sank deeper into me like a nail driven through wood. When I finally turned and fled up the stairwell, I did not look back. Yet even as I pressed the broken seal back into place, even as I locked myself in my quarters and splashed water over my face, I could still hear it. The rhythm never left. I inhaled, it clicked. I exhaled, it clicked again. A counter somewhere in the bowels of the Vatican was breathing me into its record, and there was nothing I could do to silence it. I tried to tell myself that perhaps it was only madness, exhaustion, the hallucination of a mind frayed by manuscripts and endless nights. But even now, as I write this, the pen scratches in tandem with that sound. And when I dared to glance into the mirror above my desk, the reflection was not of my face, but of brass letters shifting to keep my name alive. I should have stopped when the dial first trembled with my breath, but I leaned closer, and now it speaks my name every time I try to be silent. They summoned me in the way one summons a criminal. No words spoken, only two guards in the corridor outside my chamber, their expressions carved from the same stone as the basilica walls. I followed because refusal felt impossible. My body betrayed me with obedience. They led me down a route I didn't know existed, not to the great halls or the gilded meeting rooms that pilgrims imagine, but through narrow, sweating corridors where frescoes had rotted into smears and the smell of damp limestone was sharp as vinegar. I thought of burial vaults, of bones stacked behind locked grates, and I knew before we arrived that this wasn't about discipline. It was about containment. The cardinal was waiting in a chamber that might once have been a sacristy. The crucifix above the door was turned backward, the Christ facing the wall, as if even he was not permitted to witness what passed here. His face was pale, not from age, but from something like starvation of the soul. His eyes cut into me the way only a man who has sworn to hide something can look, both furious that I had trespassed and terrified because now I shared the burden of knowledge. His voice when it came was hoarse, stripped of ceremony. "Forget what you saw." I opened my mouth to protest, to say that I hadn't seen anything, not truly, only brass and dust, a machine like any other. But he slammed his palm against the table with a sound that echoed far too loud for the small room. "No," he hissed, leaning forward until I could smell the faint reek of stale incense clinging to his robes. "Do not lie. The counter marks those who look. You think you only saw it, but it saw you. Forget it now, or it will not forget you." Those words should have freed me. They should have given me the excuse to step back into ignorance. Instead, they only confirmed the terror blooming in me since that first tremble of the dial. If it hadn't been real, he would have laughed, dismissed me, sent me back to cataloguing parchment like an obedient servant. But his fear proved the thing's reality, and that truth shackled me tighter than any guard's hand. I nodded, but inside I knew I could never forget. Not because I didn't want to, but because it had already followed me. When they released me, I went first to the wash basin in my quarters, splashing water over my face, desperate for something clean, something mundane. And that was when I saw it. The rippling surface shimmered, then steadied, and beneath my reflection faint numbers began to form, glowing faintly like embers beneath ash. Not random, not meaningless. They pulsed in time with my breath. Inhale, one flicker higher. Exhale, one flicker lower. The basin water became a mirror of the counter itself, mocking me with proof. I staggered back, my shoulder catching the edge of the desk. Papers fluttered to the floor, their rustle as loud as confession. I dared to look up at the true mirror above the desk, and there it was again, faint numbers edging the glass, like breath fogging digits into visibility. They faded as I stared, only to return when my eyes softened, when I wasn't focusing directly. That was worse. It meant they were waiting, hiding in peripheral vision, feeding off neglect. I tried to pray. I knelt, clutching the rosary that had passed down from my grandfather, each bead polished by decades of fingers more faithful than mine. Miserere me, Deus. Have mercy on me, O God. But the words were wrong. I could feel it in my tongue. The counter twitched in my head with every phrase, clicking softly inside my skull, as though each prayer were not ascending to heaven, but sinking into the machine, feeding it data it craved. The sensation turned my stomach. I gagged, rosary still clutched in my hand. beads pressing so hard into my palm they left welts. Sleep became impossible. I would lie in my cot, eyes closed, and in the red-black darkness behind my eyelids the numbers appeared, steady, unyielding. Sometimes they climbed, sometimes they held still, sometimes they flickered back and forth as though uncertain. I wondered what they meant. Was it a measure of sins, breaths, heartbeats left before silence? I told myself it was superstition, that no mechanism, no matter how forbidden, could attach itself to me beyond the room where it sat. But every shadow corner of my chamber whispered otherwise. The next morning, my reflection betrayed me again. As I buttoned my collar, I glanced at the small oval mirror and saw not my face, but digits etched faintly across my brow, like scars written in brass. They pulsed once, twice, matching the blood in my temples. I scrubbed at my skin until it burned, but when I looked again, the digits were gone. Only my raw cheeks stared back. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the way a hunted animal feels when the forest suddenly falls silent. Presence disguised as absence. I started to notice it everywhere, in the corners of windows, in the gloss of marble tiles, in the reflections on chalices during mass numbers trailing me like a shadow that refused to obey light. I stopped attending communal prayers, claiming illness, because every time I bent my head with the others, I felt the counter tightening its grip, as though it fed not only on my prayer, but on the collective breath of the faithful. When I finally dared speak of it to a fellow archivist, he looked at me with horror, then pity, then turned away without answering. Later that night, I found a folded scrap beneath my door. No signature, just 3 words scrawled in a trembling hand. Stop feeding it. I don't know who wrote it, and I haven't seen the same archivist since. His desk has been cleared, his name stricken from the roster. I want to obey. God knows I want to. But how do you stop feeding something that drinks from your very existence? I breathe, it ticks. I blink, it ticks. I think, it ticks. To forget would mean to stop being, and even then I suspect the counter would still find a way to count what remained. The cardinal's words haunt me. Forget what you saw, or it won't forget you. I wonder now if he was warning me out of mercy or envy. Perhaps he had once seen it too. Perhaps all cardinals have, at some point, glimpsed the machinery beneath the church's skin and spent their lives pretending blindness. I cannot. I am too weak, too curious, too unwilling to surrender knowledge once tasted. And so the counter follows. In mirrors, in water, in the slick surface of my own eyes when I lean too close to the glass. It waits in the periphery, patient, relentless, pulsing like a hidden heart that has been grafted into mine. Each day the numbers seem bolder, less faint. And I cannot shake the feeling that one day soon I will wake not with my own face in the mirror, but with a dial where my brow should be, my name replaced by whatever tally it has chosen to record. I should have buried the memory beneath obedience, but I didn't, and now every reflection feels like the counter waiting to count me again. I should have left the archives alone. That was the one instruction drilled into us, over and over. Do not open what bears the triple seal. Do not even linger near the cabinets carved with the crossed keys. Those volumes were reserved for the highest scholars, for cardinals themselves, for the few who claimed to traffic with truths too dangerous for ordinary priests. But by then, it was already inside me, the counter. Its clicking had become part of my pulse, and every day I resisted the urge to investigate. I felt myself rotting with unanswered questions. The warning was useless. It had already claimed my curiosity. I remember how the keys weighed in my palm when I stole them from the desk of Father Girolamo. They didn't feel like metal. They felt warm, as though the brass had been waiting for my touch, as though my theft had been anticipated. My hand shook as I turned them in the lock, each click a mirror of the counter's rhythm. The cabinet gave way with a sigh, like a tomb disturbed. Inside were journals, not neat codices bound in calfskin, but crude, heavy books sealed with wax and stamped with the papal insignia. Some still bore red ribbons, brittle with age, that crumbled to dust as I brushed them. I hesitated. I should have turned back. But my name was still burning across my reflection every time I glanced into water, and I thought, no, I believed, that the answer was hidden here. The first journal I opened began not with scripture, not with prayers, but with lines written backward, Latin reversed so thoroughly that my lips twisted in pain as I tried to read it. Avres ameti, save them, but written in such a way that the plea became a curse. Every sentence was an inversion of the familiar, like the writer had known the prayer, but forced it through the jaws of something older. Margins smeared with brown stains, blood, or ink so corrupted it had congealed into clots. I ran my finger over one mark, before realizing it was a thumbprint, preserved perfectly, the whirl frozen in red. The deeper I read, the more I realized these were not confessions as men write them. They lacked the shame of ordinary sin, the stumbling hesitation of lust or theft or envy. These were precise, clinical recordings, written as though the pen were guided by something that counted not guilt, but weight. The writers listed not deeds, but numbers, tallies of unseen transactions. 7 consumed in his breath, 12 promised to the brass, 1 spared but marked for later. Always numbers, never stories. One diagram stopped my breath. A drawing of the same device I had touched in the forbidden chamber, its brass dials sketched with unnatural precision. But this drawing predated the counter I had seen by centuries. Older paper, older ink, the vellum scraped thin by time. Beneath the diagram, a note. It does not forgive. It does not absolve. It remembers before God remembers. I slammed the book shut, my pulse hammering. I wanted to cast it back into the cabinet, but another journal slid forward as though nudged by an invisible hand. Against my will, I opened it. These pages were worse. The confessions, they were not written in Latin, but in a language I didn't recognize, spidery, angular strokes that looped into shapes I could not keep in my head. The very act of staring at them made my eyes water. Yet between the lines, English bled through, written in desperate marginalia. Please, do not let it mark me again. And further down, it feeds on the confessor as much as the sin. I knew then these journals weren't written by men alone. No human hand writes backward prayers without slipping, without breaking rhythm. No human hand traces diagrams with lines so precise they seem burned into the page. These confessions had been dictated, whispered into the ears of those scribes by something older, something patient, something that demanded record. My stomach turned as I realized what I was holding, not repentance, but transactions. The church had not always been begging God for mercy. Sometimes it had been begging something else for restraint. I tried to stop. I did. I closed the books, shoved them back into the cabinet. But I couldn't bring myself to lock it. Some poison in me wanted to return to keep reading. That night I dreamt in numbers. I saw my father's face again, but it wasn't his voice. It was the counter, speaking through him, telling me to breathe slower so it could savor the clicks. When I woke, I found tally marks on my arm, faint as if drawn in ash, vanishing as soon as I stared too long. The following morning I returned to the cabinet. The wax seal I had broken seemed reformed, smooth as new, but the keys still turned easily, as though the Vatican itself wanted me to keep looking. The second journal I touched bled a smell of iron when opened, and on the first page was a list of names. My name was not there, yet, but the final entry ended with space, blank as though waiting. And beneath it, in the same spidery script, a phrase in Latin, peccatum est memoria. Sin is memory. That was when I understood the depth of it. The counter was never about tallying misdeeds for penance or judgment. It was about preserving memory itself, stripping it from men, keeping it alive long after the flesh was dust. Every confession written here was an offering, not to God, but to a ledger that predated even the church. These were not acts of repentance. They were contracts, and each signature smeared in blood was proof of covenant. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. For the first time, I feared not only what I had seen, but what it meant. If these confessions were not human, then every priest, every pope, every archivist who had ever touched them had been complicit. They had written words not for God, but for something older than God's mercy. And if the counter carried my name now, then perhaps my very thoughts were already being transcribed in some hidden ledger, written by a hand I could not see. I tried to pray again that night, desperate, clinging to ritual like a drowning man clings to driftwood. But when I began, the words tangled backward in my throat, slipping into the same inversions I had seen in those books. Instead of comfort, I felt the counter clicking in my chest, hungry, each syllable a bead fed into its teeth. My prayer was not prayer, it was fuel. I don't know what terrifies me more, that these confessions were never meant for God, or that I am now writing my own without meaning to. Each word I put on this page feels stolen from me, pulled by the same force that guided those long-dead scribes. And when I lift my pen, I swear I hear the faint scratching continue, as though another hand is still writing my words elsewhere, in a darker book. I should have locked the cabinet and forgotten the journals, but I didn't, and now I fear I've begun writing the next confession, and it isn't mine alone. I tell myself it's the building settling, the polite throat clearing of ancient stone after midnight, the small noises that make loneliness behave. But the sound isn't the thin, civilized tick of a clock. It is heavier, softened by moisture, the syllable of a mouth pressed to skin. It comes from wherever brass is in the room, door handle, lamp base, the little dish where I keep the stolen key, each object answering the dark with that same damp articulation. When I try to match it to my pulse, I fail. It is not my blood. It is the room's blood, and it thickens whenever I pretend not to listen. I should have stopped when the rhythm learned my breath, but I kept listening because that's what I do. I listen until the thing that shouldn't speak thinks it has permission. The voice chooses midnight because midnight is when defenses go soft. There is no overture, no cold wind, no holy warning. The wet tick gathers into a word, and the word arrives wearing my father's voice, not the papery whisper of his last week. Every sentence then cost him more than he had, but his dusk voice, the one that called me in from the alley when streetlights opened like eyes, a voice that knew basil and machine oil and the damp from a rubber hose. It says only what it has always said to me. One more. The brass answers with a pleased notch, and I feel the click like a coin slipping into a drawer that has been opened to receive it. I say his name because names are the smallest liturgies we have left, and the air refuses to return it to me. The room eats echo. It will not give me even that. What do you want? I ask, hatting how young I sound, how quickly my mouth forgets adulthood when the dead speak. The silence after the question has texture, wet leather stretched over a drum. The lamp stem warms under my fingers, not hot enough to burn, warm the way skin is warm when you could mistake it for listening. The voice is patient in the particular way of collectors. One more, it repeats, and the mirror on my wall fogs with faint numbers that rise and hover like gnats. I try prayer because muscle remembers what mind dennies. Miserere me, Deus and crea, but the word create sticks sideways in my mouth, and the plaster behind me gives in, just a little, as if something has pressed its wet face to the wall to hear better. A sweet, sour smell like snuffed candles and old iron runs through the room. The tick tightens on the last syllable and seems to smile. I bargain, because bargaining is cowardice dressed as piety, and I am fluent in both. If I reseal the door, if I return the key, if I copy out penances until my hand remembers obedience, if I burn my notes and stop saying the word counter, even in my head, will it let me be a man again instead of an index? One more, my father says with such tenderness, I almost mistake it for mercy. And in the mirror, the digits on my brow comb upward by one. I hate that the arithmetic is gentle. It is more frightening than rage. Rage you can fight, gentleness you obey. So I test it the way a tongue tests a bruise. I had sworn after Compline not to read, as a small ritual of refusal, the way a child might put a stone in his pocket and call it a vow. I break the vow the instant the lamp refuses to die. The flame draws itself into a thin, bright needle and stays. I open a ledger of shipments, meaningless columns I've skimmed a dozen times, and there, nested between quantities and dates as if it belonged, is a notation I hadn't seen. Indices, 2 crates, delivered to Zstair, no public route. I would not have found it if I had kept faith. The brass clicks once satisfied. The room does not gloat, it never gloats, it keeps books. But one offering does not sate anyone whose appetite is numbers, not stories. The mirror has been a cruelty to me for days, those faint digits that emboss my brow when I am not guarding against them, and some venom in me wants to know whether the numbers rise when the voice speaks. I drag the glass toward me like a conspirator and hold it flat the way conservators test gilding. My face shivers in the shallow bowl. The blur is a kindness, and in kindness the digits grow braver. One more, my father says, almost fond, and the numbers lift by one with the refined motion of a violinist adjusting pitch. I don't know what they measure. Sins, breaths, heartbeats left until zero. I tell myself it is a trick of nerves. My body answers by weeping without tears. Anger steadies me long enough to move. Boots, key, corridor. The wax on the forbidden door has learned how to impersonate innocence. I push my thumb through the crest, and it yields like a healed wound that was waiting to be reopened. Down the narrow stair, the saints blink from frescoes that flake like dandruff. None of them will meet my eyes. The chamber's air slicks the tongue as if I have licked a coin. The rows of dials do not whirl the way a nightmare would demand. They advance with decorum, like a choir taking notes from an unseen hand. I go straight to the nameless dial that learned my breath and do what I have not done yet. I press my ear to the glass, as if a person I love stands on the other side of a door and must whisper to be believed. At first the brass is cool, and then merely warm, and then, because horror understands theatre, it is damp, the kind of damp that makes two skins into one membrane. Within the dial I do not hear gears. I hear small mouths working. I hear patience. I hear drips collected and swallowed so close to my ear that I taste the metal. When the voice arrives from inside that intimacy, it is dressed in familiarity. One more, he says, and the needle taps my cheek as if knuckles touched wood in the pattern he used when he came home and did not want to wake my mother. 3 light knocks, loving without presumption. Everything in me leans toward the glass. I hate myself for how quickly I forgive. I ask the wrong question because bureaucracy taught me to confuse rules with mercy. One more what? The room answers with pressure instead of letters. My ears pop, my chest compresses the way a church does when too many people kneel at once. A workbench behind me creaks as if it has agreed to the idea of a guest sitting on it. I do not turn. The dial is not proud. It doesn't need my face to make its point. One more, the voice repeats, and now the wet tick has learned to mimic my own breath perfectly. For a second, I don't know which of us is front and which is mirror. I leave because leaving is the only verb that still resembles freedom. The room, polite to the end, sends proof with me. As I climb, the stair hums the tune my father used over the sink when the day was stubborn and would not let his hands go. In my room, the radiator takes up the melody without being taught. The key turns itself a fraction in its dish as if toward milk. I drape a towel over the mirror and know how foolish it is even while I do it. Towels don't unwrite covenants. I close my eyes and watch numbers glow on the inside of my skull, pale as names stitched into a burial cloth. At dawn I attempt thrift, as if frugality can cheat accountants. I ration my breathing, count 4 in and 4 out and hold childish arithmetic that belonged to the old world where lungs were private. The room refuses insult. From the basin drain, a thick drip counted. From the lamp base, a sympathetic twang counted. Behind my eyes, a small pulse counted. I think of the night my father gave me his old watch and said time is the sacrament we are allowed because we cannot be trusted with eternity. Now someone else carries the watch for me. Now someone else sets it. All morning I try to fit the story back into the shape that hurts least. The counter records what I do, I tell myself, and later it will judge me. But the voice breaks the logic like a priest breaking bread and leaves me staring at what has always been true. It doesn't care what I did. It cares what I will do next. One more is not an afterwards. It is an instruction. The cabinet I broke, the journals I read, the key I kept, the vow I bent, even the breath I learned to measure. Each was the nudge toward the next act, the next bite, the next pleasing click. It isn't counting sins. It is coaching them. I should have ended it when it borrowed my father and rang my life like a bell. I should have sealed the door, burned the notebooks, blistered my thumbs needing wax until the crest looked newborn, shoved cotton in my ears, and waited out the night like a coward who wants to live. I did none of that. I kept listening. I keep listening even now, as the numbers on my brow begin to show without fog, as the brass in the room warms like skin preparing to be kissed. And in that warmth, the sentence is already finishing itself. One more, he whispers, and I know with a certainty that makes me sick that the next time I descend, I will not go to witness. I will go to complete what it once completed. I should have stopped when my father's voice came back from the brass, but I leaned closer, and now one more is the only prayer the room lets me say. I had avoided the open courtyards for days, telling myself I was buried in catalogues, that the work required isolation, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid of being seen. Whatever the counter had begun writing in me was private so long as I stayed hidden among stone and parchment. But I cannot live entirely beneath lamps and whispers. Eventually, I had to cross the square. The air outside struck me like a baptism, sunlight, pigeons, the murmur of prayer, but none of it felt like mercy. It felt like an unveiling. I kept my eyes low, walking as I always had, but I felt the change before I noticed it. The hush of hundreds of pilgrims bent toward the basilica swerved, subtly, as though part of the tide had turned against me. At first, I thought it was paranoia, that the counter had twisted my nerves so badly I could no longer inhabit ordinary space. But then the whispers reached me, half-formed syllables sliding between Italian, Latin, and the raw sound of fear. I dared to look up. Dozens of faces were angled toward me. Some leaned close to one another as though confirming a vision. Others simply turned away and pressed fingers to their foreheads, to their lips, to their hearts. The sign of the cross, performed as if shielding themselves from a contagion that walked in my skin. I tried to walk faster, to thread my way through the murmuring sea, but the crowd seemed to resist me, bodies shifting just enough to force my path wide, as if instinctively creating a perimeter around something unclean. A child, lifted on his mother's hip, pointed directly at me with the casual cruelty only children possess. "His numbers are showing," he said in a voice far too clear for the distance. His mother clamped a hand over his mouth, her eyes never meeting mine, but I had already heard. Everyone had. The whisper of it rippled outward like incense smoke. My heart thrashed. I needed proof, something beyond rumor and staring eyes. That was when I saw it. A shop window, polished bright to lure tourists toward postcards and rosaries. I moved toward it as though pulled, unable to resist. In its glass, I should have seen only myself, haggard, pale, another weary servant of the archives. Instead, across my forehead glowed faint brass digits, not written in ink, not carved, but burning as though my skin itself had become a dial. They shifted faintly as I watched, ticking upward by one with every uneven breath. I staggered back, colliding with a man who recoiled as though my touch burned. He spat on the ground and muttered a prayer I recognized only partly. It wasn't quite the Ave Maria, but something older, tangled, desperate. My shame should have been overwhelming, but what I felt instead was confirmation. The counter had not only claimed me, it had begun engraving me into the visible world. My private damnation was becoming public record. The rest of the crossing blurred. I walked faster, nearly running, until the crowd was behind me. But the voices followed in my head. His numbers are showing. Numbers that no one had ever explained to me. Numbers that seemed to tally breaths, sins, promises, maybe even thoughts. I wanted to scream at them, to demand if they knew what the digits meant, but I couldn't force the words. I feared that if I asked, the counter itself might answer through their mouths. Back in my quarters, I locked the door and tried again with the mirror. My reflection betrayed me the way it always did. Faint glimmers, digits rising and falling just out of focus. But what the pilgrims had seen was clearer, brighter, undeniable. Why could they see when I could not? Was it because they were innocent? Or because innocence recognizes corruption more easily than the corrupted recognize themselves? Sleep offered no reprieve. I dreamt of crowds gathering beneath my window, chanting my numbers as though they were scripture, each digit louder than the last until the square itself shook. I woke with sweat on my chest and a sound in my ears, ticking, but no longer wet. This was sharper, metallic, echoing as though struck against bells. I pressed my palms against my temples, but the sound came from within, not without. I remembered the cardinal's warning. Forget, or it will not forget you. But forgetting is impossible once strangers point and whisper. Forgetting is impossible once a child recognizes what you pretend not to see. And worst of all, forgetting is impossible when every breath feeds the very thing you're trying to deny. I could feel the counter inside me now, not in the distance of forbidden chambers, but beneath my ribs, behind my eyes. The numbers weren't on my skin, they were in my blood. The brass digits on my forehead were only the outward symptom of an infection already complete. I tried to write it down, hoping transcription would lessen the burden. But the moment I pressed pen to paper, the ink smeared into symbols not of my choosing, loops and angular marks that looked like the backward prayers from the sealed journals. My hand wrote even when I forced myself to stop, letters tearing across the page in a language I did not know, and every sentence ended with the same mark, a tally. I dropped the pen, horrified, but when I dared glance back, the page was already dry. The ink had sunk into the fibers as though it belonged. My confessions were writing themselves. Days passed, or maybe only hours. Time had begun to lose its ordinary rhythm, replaced by the steady cadence of the counter inside me. I no longer heard the bells of the Vatican without overlaying them against the ticking. When they tolled noon, my digits leapt. When they tolled vespers, the digits slowed, as though amused by the symmetry. I understood then that I was no longer living apart from the device. I was a dial in its great machinery, another part of its endless counting. And yet the most terrifying part is not the digits themselves. It is what they mean to others. In St. Peter's Square they had crossed themselves, they had shielded their children. They had recognized me not as man, not as servant, but as omen. They had seen not my face, but my function, a ledger walking, a record in flesh. And if they could see it once, they would see it again. I could not hide forever. Eventually I would be paraded like scripture. Eventually I would be read aloud. I should have buried myself in the archives and never walked the square, but I did. And now the world has seen the numbers the counter carved into me, numbers I cannot read, but everyone else can. There comes a point where fear curdles into defiance, where the body can no longer endure waiting for a doom it cannot name, and so it attempts to strike first. That was where I had arrived. The digits on my brow had grown bolder, reflections had turned into accusations, and every whisper in the basilica seemed to carry my name. I told myself that if the counter could be destroyed, burned, shattered, erased, then perhaps I could tear my name free of its ledger. Perhaps it would forget me if I silenced it. I clung to that delusion, like a drowning man clings to driftwood. So I prepared. From the sacristy, I stole a vial of holy oil meant for anointing the dying. From the maintenance closets, I pilfered matches and an old hammer, its handle slick with years of sweat. I hid them beneath my robe, the clinking of metal and glass against my ribs sounding to me like the rattling chains of a condemned man. The night I chose was a feast day, when bells drowned most other sounds, and the basilica was too distracted to notice one archivist vanishing into the undercroft. My hands trembled so violently I had to clutch the stair rail just to descend, yet beneath the terror was a throb of anticipation. It felt like a ritual. The chamber greeted me as always, air damp, marble gleaming faintly with its own pallor. The dials sat in neat rows, unhurried, composed, like parishioners waiting for a mass only they understood. I focused on the nameless dial, the one that had first trembled with my breath, and laid the vial of oil across its brass face. For a heartbeat nothing happened, and hope flared in me absurd, as though perhaps the thing feared what I carried. Then the glass grew hot in my hand, the oil within boiling before I had even struck a match. I yanked the stopper free and splashed it across the console. The scent filled the chamber instantly, sharp, bitter, sacred. My hand shook as I struck the match and dropped it. Flame leapt like a chorus long held silent. It clung to the brass not as fire clings to wood, but as though the machine itself desired it. The dials glowed red, the numbers etched into their faces brightening until they seemed molten. But the brass did not warp. The structure did not collapse. The fire was not consuming it, it was feeding it. Before I could retreat, the flames licked upward, racing across the oil that still clung to my hands. They wrapped my fingers, my wrists, my arms, until I screamed with the certainty that I was burning alive. Only I was not burning. My skin did not blister, my flesh did not char. Instead, lines appeared beneath the surface, glowing faintly, branching along my veins as though molten metal had been poured directly into me. Tally marks, small notches, delicate as script, rising in columns along my arms. I staggered back, shrieking, beating my arms against the stone in desperation, but the marks did not fade. They pulsed. They counted. The dials before me spun wildly, faster than I had ever seen, the clicking no longer measured but frantic, like applause in some unholy theatre. I clutched the hammer then, furious, and swung with all my strength against the nameless dial. The blow should have cracked glass, should have dented brass, but the hammerhead bounced back as if I had struck granite. The recoil jarred my shoulder, sent shockwaves up my arm, but the dial remained unmarred. Worse, when I looked again, I saw my own reflection staring back from its polished surface, digits glowing across my brow. I smashed it again, and again, until my arms shook with exhaustion, but the counter only absorbed the blows, its clicking steadier now, almost amused. Smoke filled the chamber, thick and acrid, though I realized in horror it was not rising from the console but from me. My breath emerged as black vapor, curling upward, staining the air. Each exhale produced more, as though the tally marks beneath my skin were burning incense from my blood. The counter fed on it, the dials gleaming brighter, the sound of clicking now inside my chest, matching the hammer of my heart. I collapsed, choking, clawing at my throat as if I could tear the smoke out. My knees struck marble, my hands slick with oil and sweat and ash. I begged aloud, not knowing to whom, to God, to the machine, to my father's ghost that had whispered one more. The words tumbled from me without shape, pleas, promises, bargains. Take it back, I gasped. Take it out of me. The chamber answered with silence, then with inevitability. The flames dwindled, retreating into the brass as though reabsorbed. The smoke thinned. My hammer lay useless beside me. And in that sudden quiet I understood I had not destroyed the counter. I had opened myself to it. The tally marks no longer glowed, but I could feel them beneath my skin, embedded into my veins, pulsing faintly with each heartbeat. The dials had not stopped spinning. They had simply relocated. They were inside me now, recording, ticking, waiting. When I finally staggered back to my chamber, my hands still trembled, not from fear alone but from vibration. Every object I touched, doorknobs, pens, chalices, shivered faintly at my touch, as though resonating with the rhythm inside me. When I pressed my ear to my own chest, I heard it. Not the rush of blood, not the thrum of muscle, but the steady, mechanical click of brass tallying existence. Sleep offered no escape. Dreams were invaded by numbers scrolling endlessly across darkness, tally marks scoring themselves into flesh that was sometimes mine, sometimes not. I woke gasping, certain I had heard the counter's voice murmuring within my ribcage, though the words were muffled by bone. I tried to pray again, whispering Pater Noster until the syllables blurred, but the rhythm of the words only made the ticking louder. Every phrase seemed to fuel it, every plea another notch in the unseen ledger. Prayer was no longer communication, it was transaction, and the counter never forgave debt. The next morning I looked into the mirror, and for the first time the digits did not wait in the periphery. They glowed clearly, etched across my brow, shifting as I watched. I raised a trembling hand, touched the numbers, half expecting them to be warm. But it was worse than that. They pulsed faintly with the beat of my heart, not separate from me, of me. And so I understood, with the clarity of despair, that there would be no destroying it. The counter was not an object to be broken, not a machine to be dismantled. It was a record, and I had allowed it entry. It lived now where even God could not reach to remove it, beneath my skin, behind my ribs, inside my blood. I should have let it sit in silence, but I tried to burn it, and now the ticking no longer comes from the chamber, but from my own chest. They did not knock, they did not announce themselves. They simply appeared inside my chamber like verdicts already written. 3 guards, armed but visibly shaken, their eyes refusing to find mine as they bound my wrists. Their silence was worse than accusation. If they had cursed me, I could have resisted. If they had called me heretic, I could have argued. But silence is what the Church reserves for those it cannot cleanse, only contain. My pulse thundered with the sound of the counter inside me, the tick now indistinguishable from heartbeat. When they pulled me into the hall, the lamps flickered, and I swear every brass fixture clicked once in sympathy. We descended through corridors I had never walked, stair after stair spiraling downward, farther than even the deepest archives. The air thickened, hot and dry, then ash-scented. At last we entered a cavernous space hollowed beneath the city itself. The chamber was circular, its walls ringed with alcoves, and in each alcove stood a counter. Not one, not a dozen, but scores of them. Brass dials, glass faces, needles twitching faintly in rhythm with nothing I could hear. Each one bore a plate engraved with a name. As the torchlight caught them, my stomach lurched. I knew those names. Some belonged to men whose obituaries I had read in the Vatican bulletins, priests who had died suddenly, bishops who had been quietly reassigned and then never spoken of again. Others were names whispered in scandal, men whose sins had been scrubbed from the public record but whose memory lingered in rumor. And still others, dread choked me, were names I had seen only in the forbidden journals, confessions not written by men but by something older through their hands. Names consigned to memory not by God, but by the counter. The guards pushed me toward the center of the chamber where iron chains waited, bolted into marble blackened with centuries of smoke. They shackled my wrists, my ankles, my throat. I could feel the cold iron leaching into me, but worse was the way the counters seemed to respond. One by one, their needles twitched, then ticked upward in unison. Dozens of devices, recording something I could not fathom, recording me. I dared to whisper, "What happens here?" None of the guards answered. They kept their eyes on the floor, lips pressed tight. But as one turned to leave, he faltered, his hands shaking. He leaned close enough that I could smell the fear on his breath. "Don't let it reach zero," he whispered. His words rattled me more than the chains. I wanted to demand what he meant, but he fled before I could speak again. Zero, the word clanged in my skull like a bell. Every dial I had ever seen ticked upward, counted forward. But what would it mean to reach zero? Did the numbers measure sins remaining, breaths left, or simply the distance until erasure? The thought settled in me like poison. The chamber pulsed with silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking, dozens of machines breathing together. Their faces seemed to glow in the dim light, pale brass halos bearing the weight of damnation. I searched for my own name, terrified and compelled, scanning each plate. There it was, glinting faintly. My name engraved on a counter set slightly apart from the others, its needle trembling, digits glowing. The numbers weren't random anymore. They matched the ones I had seen burned into my reflection, the digits pilgrims had whispered about. And even as I watched, the counter ticked upward, then downward, as if uncertain whether to spare or consume me. I pulled against the chains until my wrists bled, but the iron did not yield. My breath grew ragged, and every gasp seemed to stir the counter, as though my lungs were no longer mine, but valves in its machine. The walls pressed closer with every exhale, and I understood why the guards had not spoken. They were afraid that if they named the truth aloud, the machines would record their words too. The stillness was broken by a low groan, not from me, not from stone, but from the counters themselves. The needles began to twitch in unison, faster now, dials spinning as though something had commanded them to attention. I felt pressure in my chest, a fist tightening around my heart, forcing me to match their rhythm. My own counter surged forward, the digits glowing hotter, brighter. I could feel it inside my ribs, each notch scraping upward with a sound no one else could hear. And then it happened. The needle spun violently, digits unraveling downward until they froze on a single mark, zero. The chamber exhaled like a furnace, and I thought the end had come. But the chains held me upright, forcing me to endure. The other counters responded, ticking louder, their needles racing toward zero in sympathy. The sound was unbearable, not the measured clicks of mechanics, but the hungry chatter of jaws closing around a final meal. Something shifted in the air then, a weight pressing against my skull. Words formed, not in Latin, not in any tongue I recognized, but directly within the marrow of my bones. "You are ledger now." The voice was neither singular nor plural, but both, a choir of machines speaking as one. I screamed, not in defiance but in terror, because the words were true. I was no longer merely recorded. I was becoming the record. The numbers on my counter flickered, then steadied. Not zero, not complete, but waiting, paused. My body convulsed with the realization that zero was not death. Zero was consummation. Zero meant the machine had finished with you, that you had been erased, your memory consumed into its endless archive. My digits had paused because it was not done with me. It wanted me to go on, to keep feeding it, to finish the story it had begun writing in my flesh. When at last the guards returned, they found me trembling, my chains rattling against stone. They did not ask what I had seen. They did not dare meet my eyes. They unshackled me in silence, led me back through the tunnels, and left me in my chamber without explanation. But I knew what they would not say. I was marked, not only by brass and digits, but by the fear etched into their silence. I should have fought to forget, but I didn't. And now I know what waits at zero, and that one day the counter will drag me there. Midnight is not a time, it is a verdict. That was the truth I learned when the bells tolled across the Vatican and every counter answered, not separately, but together. The chamber beneath the city roared alive, not with fire or thunder, but with the simple, relentless clatter of brass. It was not sound, it was judgment made audible. Every dial that had sat in patient silence began to twitch, then spin, clicking in unison until the very air shook with their hunger. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. My own counter, the one that bore my name, did not simply join the chorus. It surged forward, digits flickering so quickly my eyes could no longer keep pace. Upward, downward, numbers folding into themselves until they became meaningless, until arithmetic itself collapsed. My heart raced to keep up, but it was futile. Then, in a single lurching motion, the dial stopped. The numbers froze, all the etched brass glowing like molten coin. And then they unraveled, collapsing inward, until nothing remained but a solitary zero. The silence after was worse than the noise. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. And then the walls wept. Not with water, not with oil, but with scripture, lines of Latin oozing from the marble like blood from a wound. Verses I recognized from the Psalms, but backward, inverted, words twisted into a tongue meant for something older than man. They dripped downward, forming letters across the floor, pooling at my knees. I tried to turn away, but the chains held me, forcing me to watch as the sacred was inverted into sacrilege. The moment my dial reached zero, something inside me tore loose. My thoughts, memories, even ones I cherished, slipped from me like pages torn from a book. I tried to clutch them, to hold my own life against the tide, but they dissolved. Worse still, what returned was not mine. Into me poured recollections of sins I had not committed. A woman's scream choked off in an alley, blood dripping from hands that were not mine. Coins pocketed from the altar of a village church. Blasphemies spat at icons in a language I had never spoken. These lives, these crimes, poured into me like ink siphoned from stolen manuscripts. I gagged, choking on guilt that did not belong to me, memories that fit my body like a parasite wearing skin. I tried to scream, to cry for God, for mercy, for anything. But when my mouth opened, the voice that answered was not my own. It was deeper, older, laced with static and brass. The words tumbled out in a language I both knew and did not know, syllables that burned my tongue but fit perfectly into the rhythm of the chamber. I was speaking, yes, but I was also being spoken through. I was ledger and pen and voice, all at once. The counters around me responded, their dials clicking in answer to my stolen voice. They pulsed with light, every needle pointing towards zero. It was not just me, it was all of them, all the names engraved in brass. Their sins, their lives, their memories, all feeding into the same collapse. And I understood with a terror beyond words. Zero was not emptiness. Zero was completion. The more I spoke, the less of myself remained. Childhood memories flickered and vanished, the scent of basil in my father's garden, the sound of my mother's lullaby. In their place came things I could not endure, centuries of secrets, acts of cruelty done in the name of church and shadow. I felt myself dissolve into a procession of souls long devoured. They were not gone. They were inside me, wearing me, speaking through me. The walls convulsed, frescoes cracking open to reveal not plaster, but veins of brass that pulsed like arteries. The entire chamber had become a body, and I was chained within its heart. I screamed again, but the sound was wrong. harmonic, layered, as though dozens of voices spoke in unison through my throat. My ears rang with it, yet my body trembled with awe and despair, because some part of me knew this was the purpose of the counter all along: to reach zero, to collapse sin and memory until one voice spoke for them all. I felt my face split, not physically but spiritually, as though the mirror image of myself was being peeled away. I saw my reflection on the polished surface of the counter, but it was not me. It was a man, older, younger, thinner, fatter, 1,000 faces stitched together. My name flickered, then collapsed, replaced by others, centuries worth of names scrolling faster than I could read. When at last the reflection settled, it was blank. No name, just zero. The chains rattled, but not from my struggle. They moved as if something else pulled them taut, dragging me upright like a puppet. My arms spread wide, head forced back. I tried to resist, but my muscles obeyed the rhythm of the counters, not my will. The zero glowed on my forehead, burning into skin I could no longer feel as my own. In the periphery, I thought I saw the guards. Their faces were ashen, their hands clasped over their mouths. They would not intervene, they could not. They had known this would happen. Perhaps they had brought me here for this very purpose, to complete the ledger that had waited centuries for another voice. One of them whispered, so faint I might have imagined it, "Now you belong." And perhaps he was right, because as the last of my memories bled away, I realized the horror was not in losing myself. The horror was in what replaced me, the ledger, endless and insatiable, now speaking through me, now living within me. I was no longer man, no longer servant, no longer sinner. I was record. The ticking slowed, the dials steadied. My zero glowed steady as a wound that would not close. And in that quiet, I understood there was no escape. The counter had not ended me. It had completed me. I should have fought to keep even a fragment of myself, but I didn't. And now the voice that speaks through me belongs to every sin that ever reached zero. I do not remember how I slipped the chains. One moment they were iron biting into my wrists and throat, the next I was stumbling forward, free, though the links still rattled in my ears like phantom shackles. The guards did not stop me. They didn't even look. Their faces were pale masks, eyes downcast, as if acknowledging me would mean seeing their own numbers burn into existence. So I ran. Blind, frantic, through tunnels that smelled of ash and mildew, through sewers slick with filth, and the remnants of prayers whispered by men who thought God listened in darkness. When I emerged, Rome was not the Rome I had known. The night sky was a ledger, stars no longer twinkling, but aligning into dials, constellations ticking as though the heavens themselves were another machine. The bridges beneath my feet groaned with each step, the stones trembling faintly as though they too carried numbers beneath their surfaces. I wanted to believe it was delirium, that the counter had infected only my sight, but then I saw them. Faces, ordinary passers-by crossing the piazza, their brows faintly illuminated with digits. Some were low, single numbers flickering like candlelight. Others glowed higher, climbing in sequences I couldn't follow. None of them noticed. None of them knew, but I saw. I could not unsee. At first I thought it was only the faithful, those who prayed in the square, their numbers tallying devotion or sin. But as I ran farther, through streets where merchants still packed away their wares, through taverns where laughter spilled into the night, I saw digits on them too. Children, drunkards, beggars, all of them bore the faint brass glimmer. The counter had not stayed below. It had spread upward, outward, until Rome itself pulsed with its rhythm. Every breath, every thought, every faltering step was inscribed. I ducked into an alley, chest heaving, my own numbers blazing in the glass of a shop window. Zero still hovered there, but beside it, faint digits flickered upward as if beginning again. My skin burned with the memory of tally marks etched into my veins. I pressed my palm against the reflection, desperate to smudge it away, but the brass digits only glowed brighter. Behind me, I could hear the city ticking, lampposts, fountains, church bells, all of them in sync. Rome was no longer Rome. It was a vast ledger, and I was trapped inside its account book. I tried to pray. The words tasted hollow, like dry ash breaking on my tongue. Pater noster qui es in celis. But as soon as I spoke them, the digits on my brow flared, and I felt the counter inside me click in response. Prayer was no longer resistance. It was transaction, a feeding. I clamped my jaw shut and ran again, down toward the river. Crossing the Tiber, I saw the water ripple, and beneath the ripples gleamed numbers, not reflections, but glowing figures drifting in the current like drowned souls. The realization sickened me. The counter was not bound to brass or marble. It was in everything now, every surface, every mirror, every body. Rome was just the beginning. I don't know how many hours I fled. The city blurred into a map of digits, a world rewritten in brass arithmetic. And the worst part, the terrible truth, was that no one else seemed to see it. They walked, they laughed, they prayed, oblivious. Only I could see the tally burning across every brow, the hidden click with every breath. But if the counter had chosen me as witness, it was not for my salvation. It was for my confession. I write this now in a rented room, the shutters drawn tight though even wood seems to pulse with faint ticks. My hands shake so violently the ink trembles across the page. But I must tell it, because silence is no longer mine to keep. If I do not write, the counter writes for me, scratching invisible words into my skin, into the air, into the glass. Better that I set it down myself. Better that I warn you. Because it no longer belongs to me. I'm not its host. I'm only the first to notice. Every face I pass proves it, digits glowing faintly, tallies pulsing like veins. The counter has bled out of its chamber, out of its brass prison, and now it feeds on the world entire. It is not counting sins. It is counting everything. Breaths, thoughts, doubts, dreams. And when the digits reach zero, when the tally completes, something is erased. Not just memory, not just life, but the very record of existence. I have seen names vanish from plaques, obituaries scrubbed clean, men erased so thoroughly it is as though they never were. I should have stopped at the broken seal. I should have left the chamber untouched. But I leaned closer, again and again, until the counter climbed out of its brass and into me. And now it has climbed out of me into everything else. If you are reading this, look into the nearest mirror. Look into water, into glass. You will see faint digits, maybe too faint at first, maybe only a shimmer when the light bends right. That is how it begins. Ignore them and they will grow clearer. Count them and they will count you back. Pray and you will feed it. Pretend you don't see and you will only be lying to yourself. The counter does not forget. It does not absolve. It only remembers, and once remembered, never releases. It has remembered me. Now it remembers you. I should have left it buried in brass and stone, but I didn't. And now every number you see is proof that the counter has already begun counting you too.